At my sister's wedding, she mocked me in her speech. My sister is a single mother unwanted by anyone. The room laughed. My mom added she is a used product. Dad covered his mouth to stifle a chuckle. Then the groom stood up and grabbed the mic. The room froze. My name is Eleanor, 33 years old, and today I watched my family's facade crumble to dust. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a monument to financial irresponsibility. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast a golden glow over 50 tables draped in imported silk. Towering arrangements of white orchids and peonies blocked the view of the string quartet playing softly in the corner. I sat at table 42, tucked away near the kitchen doors, holding the hand of my 7-year-old son Leo. We were placed exactly where my parents wanted us, out of sight and out of mind, hidden behind a pillar, so my presence would not ruin the aesthetic of their perfect evening. Stephanie, my 29-year-old sister, stood on the elevated stage at the front of the room. She wore a custom designer gown that cost more than a luxury car, the silk train cascading down the steps. She held a crystal flute of champagne in one hand and a silver microphone in the other. Her new husband, Jamal, sat at the sweetheart table beside her. Jamal was a brilliant corporate lawyer from a highly respected old-money African-American family in Chicago. His parents seated at the VIP table radiated quiet dignity and grace, a sharp contrast to my own parents, who were currently busy waving at the photographer to ensure they were in every shot. Stephanie tapped her manicured fingernail against her glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the chatter of the 300 guests. She smiled brightly, the kind of smile she reserved for an audience. She spent the first 10 minutes of her speech talking entirely about herself. She recounted her expensive vacations, her luxury shopping trips, and how she had finally found a man capable of funding her lifestyle. I kept my eyes on Leo, quietly cutting his chicken into small pieces, trying to ignore the absolute lack of substance in my sister's words. Then Stephanie's gaze shifted across the room, piercing through the crowd, until it landed exactly on my dark corner. Her smile twisted into something cruel and familiar. She raised her glass higher. "Let us all raise a glass to my older sister Eleanor," she announced, her voice echoing through the massive speakers. The spotlight operator, clearly instructed beforehand, swung a blinding white beam across the room until it pinned Leo and me against the wall. 300 heads turned to stare at us. "Eleanor is a true inspiration," Stephanie continued, her tone dripping with mock pity. "She shows us all exactly what not to do with our lives. My sister is a single mother unwanted by anyone. She has been living in the garden shed behind our parents' house ever since her husband dumped her. She is unemployed, struggling, and basically eating my leftovers. But out of the goodness of my heart, I allowed her to come tonight so she could see what a real successful relationship looks like." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. It started as a low murmur and quickly swelled into cruel, open amusement. I felt Leo grip my arm tightly, his small body trembling. I placed my hand over his ears and pulled him close, keeping my face completely blank. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. My mother Diane sat at the front table wearing a sequined dress that was far too young for her 58 years. She leaned into the microphone stand nearby and added her own commentary. "She is a used product," Diane said loudly, making sure the entire front row heard her. "What kind of man wants a woman who cannot even keep a husband?" Beside her, my father Richard covered his mouth with his hand, shaking his shoulders as he stifled a chuckle. He did not defend me, he never did. He simply enjoyed the spectacle of my humiliation, validating his belief that anyone who did not pursue a traditional status-driven corporate career was entirely worthless. They thought I was broken. They thought I was a helpless victim who spent her days crying in a drafty garden shed. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy maintaining their shallow social image, I had spent the last 7 years coding late into the night. They did not know that I was the data architect, an anonymous founder of Novatech, an artificial intelligence startup that provided data solutions to the world's largest luxury retailers. They did not know my company was currently valued at over $200 million. As the laughter continued to echo off the vaulted ceiling, Jamal slowly stood up from his chair. The movement was deliberate and cold. He was an imposing figure, impeccably dressed in a tailored tuxedo, his expression completely devoid of the joy a groom should have on his wedding day. He walked up the 2 steps to the stage and stood beside Stephanie. She beamed at him, expecting him to join in on the joke. Instead, Jamal reached out and snatched the microphone from her hand with such force that she stumbled backward. The feedback whined sharply through the speakers, instantly silencing the room. The laughter died abruptly. 300 guests stared at the stage, sensing the sudden dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Jamal did not look at Stephanie. He looked directly at my parents. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick folded stack of papers. He tossed them onto the sweetheart table. They landed with a heavy thud, sliding across the silk tablecloth. "I am a corporate attorney," Jamal said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying calm that sent a chill through the room. "My entire career is built on examining financial disclosures, uncovering hidden assets, and identifying fraud. When I marry someone, I ensure our financial foundations are transparent." Stephanie lost her smile. Her hands began to shake. "Jamal, baby, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely picked up by the microphone. Jamal ignored her. He looked out at his own family. His father, a prominent federal judge in Chicago, sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on his son with solemn understanding. Jamal turned his gaze back to my parents, who were now gripping the edges of their table. "2 days ago, I conducted a standard background asset check on my future wife and her family." Jamal continued, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. "I discovered a very interesting series of transactions. It appears that Grandpa Henry left a specific educational trust fund entirely in Leo's name. A fund containing exactly $150,000 meant for a little boy's college tuition." I sat up straight, my heart pounding against my ribs. Grandpa Henry had passed away 3 years ago. My parents had told me he left nothing behind, claiming his medical bills had drained his estate. I had believed them. "Since Leo is a minor." Jamal's voice grew colder, harder. "Richard and Diane were listed as the temporary legal custodians of that account. Custodians who had a fiduciary duty to protect that money. Instead, last month they authorized a complete liquidation of the trust. They transferred every single cent of a 7-year-old boy's future into a joint checking account shared with Stephanie." Gasps erupted from the crowd. The guests from Jamal's side of the family looked at my parents with absolute disgust. My mother's face turned the color of chalk. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jamal picked up one of the papers from the table and read directly from it. $30,000 for imported white orchids. $50,000 for a custom designer gown. $10,000 for a champagne fountain. You paid for this entire grotesque circus by stealing from a child. You stole from your own grandson so you could stand on a stage and mock the very woman whose child you robbed." Stephanie lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone. "Jamal, stop. You are ruining everything. We can explain. It was a family loan." Jamal stepped back easily, avoiding her grasp. "There is no explanation for theft, Stephanie. There is no excuse for the absolute moral bankruptcy I have witnessed here tonight. You look down on your sister because you think she has nothing. But the truth is, you have nothing. You are a parasite wearing a stolen dress, surrounded by flowers bought with stolen money." He dropped the papers back onto the table. "I will not tie my name, my reputation, or my family's legacy to a family of thieves and liars. There is no marriage today. This wedding is completely and immediately canceled." Jamal placed the microphone carefully on the table. He did not throw it. He did not shout. His absolute composure made the devastation of his words even more absolute. He stepped off the stage and walked directly toward his parents. His father stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and offered his arm to his wife. Without a single backward glance, Jamal and his entire family turned and walked out of the ballroom, their footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then absolute chaos erupted. Stephanie dropped to her knees right there on the stage, screaming hysterically. Her wails bounced off the walls, a raw, piercing sound of pure panic. Diane jumped out of her seat, hyperventilating as she tried to rush the stage. Guests began grabbing their coats and purses, rushing toward the exit to escape the massive scandal unfolding before their eyes. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. He looked frantically around the room until his eyes locked onto me. The shock in his expression quickly morphed into a furious, irrational rage. He genuinely believed that I was the architect of his destruction. He thought I had somehow uncovered the theft and tipped Jamal off to ruin the wedding. He stomped across the ballroom, shoving empty chairs out of his way. Diane, seeing her husband move, abandoned Stephanie on the stage and marched right behind him. Stephanie, realizing what was happening, scrambled to her feet, gathered her heavy silk skirts and ran after them. I stood up, pushing Leo gently behind my legs to shield him. I smoothed the front of my simple black dress and waited. "You ungrateful, spiteful witch!" Richard roared as he reached my table. He slammed his fist down on the tabletop, making the silverware rattle. "You told him. You dug into our private accounts, and you poisoned him against us because you are jealous. You are jealous that your sister actually found a wealthy man while you are rotting in my backyard." Diane arrived seconds later, her chest heaving. She pointed a trembling finger inches from my face. "You ruined your sister's life. I should have never let you come here. You have always been a curse on this family." She lunged forward, pulling her hand back to slap me across the face. I did not flinch. I leaned slightly backward, and her hand caught empty air, the momentum throwing her off balance, so she stumbled against the table. "I did not tell Jamal anything," I said, my voice perfectly level. "He is a corporate lawyer. He does his homework before signing a contract. You got caught stealing from your own grandson, and now you are looking for someone to blame." Stephanie arrived, her mascara running down her face in dark streaks. "You owe me a wedding," she shrieked, her hands balling into fists. "Jamal is gone. His family is gone. The hotel is going to demand the final payment for all of this tonight, and we do not have the money because the trust fund is empty. You are going to pay for this, Eleanor." Richard stepped forward, his imposing frame meant to intimidate me. "You listen to me very carefully," he growled, his face inches from mine. "You are going to take the blame for this. You are going to call Jamal and tell him you fabricated those bank statements. And if you refuse, you pack your bags tonight. You get your garbage out of my shed. I want you and that kid out on the street before midnight. You are evicted." I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had happily stolen from my child and was now threatening to render us homeless to save his own ego. I felt a profound, absolute calm wash over my entire body. The years of hiding, the years of taking their abuse to keep the peace evaporated in an instant. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I pressed a single button on my speed dial and held the phone to my ear. "Mr. Caldwell," I said clearly into the receiver, "please come over to table 42 immediately." Richard laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Who are you calling the police? You are in my house, living on my property. No one can save you from being homeless tonight." Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy wooden doors of the kitchen swung open. Mr. Caldwell, the general manager of the Plaza Hotel, walked briskly toward our table. He was a tall, distinguished man in a flawless, bespoke suit. He bypassed Richard entirely, stepping around my furious father to stand directly in front of me. To the absolute shock of my family, Mr. Caldwell bowed deeply at the waist. "Yes, Ms. Eleanor," he said, his tone filled with the utmost deference and respect. "How can I assist you this evening?" Richard stared at the manager, his mouth hanging open. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, gesturing wildly at me. "I am the father of the bride. This woman is ruining our private event. I want her and her brat thrown out of this hotel immediately. Call security." Mr. Caldwell slowly straightened his posture. He turned his head to look at Richard, his expression shifting from deferential to completely frigid. "I will do no such thing, sir," Mr. Caldwell stated firmly. "Ms. Eleanor is a Platire corporate partner of this establishment. Her company hosts its annual global summits in our grand ballrooms. You, on the other hand, currently have a massive outstanding balance for a cancelled event." Diane gasped, clutching her pearls. "What company? She is unemployed. She lives in a shed." I opened my purse again. I reached past my car keys and pulled out a heavy matte black titanium credit card. It was a Centurion card by invitation only, completely devoid of any spending limit. I tossed it onto the table. It landed with a sharp metallic clink right on top of the scattered fraudulent bank statements Jamal had left behind. "Mr. Caldwell," I said smoothly, "please charge the full cancellation penalties, the catering costs, and the cleanup fees for this entire circus to my corporate account. They clearly do not have the funds to cover the damage they have caused." Mr. Caldwell picked up the card with gloved hands. "Right away, Ms. Eleanor. I will process this immediately." He gave me another slight bow and walked briskly away, leaving my family paralyzed in a state of absolute disbelief. Richard stared at the space where the black card had been. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. "Where did you get that fake piece of plastic?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a sudden, unexplainable fear. "You are broke. You beg me to stay in the garden shed." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until Richard was forced to look me directly in the eyes. "I never begged you for anything, Richard. I paid you exactly $2,500 a month in cash to rent that drafty, unheated shed so I could stay out of your way while I built my empire." Stephanie shook her head wildly. "Empire? You make no sense. You are insane." I kept my eyes locked on my father. "You remember how you sold that shed and the large back lot of your property last month?" I asked softly. "You told me you needed to sell the land to an anonymous shell company for $300,000 to pay for the rest of this wedding. You told me the new owners were going to evict me anyway." Richard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. The color was rapidly draining from his face. "Novatech Properties is my company," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the now empty ballroom. "I am the data architect and the sole founder. I bought your land, Richard. You do not own that property anymore. You only own the main house, and you used the land money to buy dead flowers and a canceled party." Diane let out a choked, terrified sob. "So here is the new reality," I told them, my tone merciless. "I am officially invoking my rights as the property owner. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the main house, because your driveway crosses my property line, and I am bringing in bulldozers to demolish the entire back lot on Monday morning. Enjoy packing." I grabbed Leo's hand, turned my back on their horrified faces, and walked out of the Plaza Hotel, leaving them to face the financial ruin they had built with their own hands. The heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom slammed shut behind me, cutting off the frantic screams of my sister. I kept a firm but gentle grip on Leo's hand as we crossed the vast expanse of the Plaza Hotel lobby. The crystal chandeliers above cast long shadows across the imported marble floor, illuminating the intricate gold leaf patterns carved into the walls. I just wanted to get my son into the waiting car and leave this toxic chapter of my life behind forever. But the peace only lasted for exactly 20 seconds. The ballroom doors burst open with a violent crash. Richard stormed out, his face a dangerous shade of crimson, his expensive tuxedo jacket flapping wildly around his sides. Diane and Stephanie trailed right behind him. Stephanie was holding the heavy layers of her ruined silk wedding dress, her makeup completely destroyed by tears of rage. They did not care that wealthy hotel guests and bellhops were turning to stare at them. They only cared about tearing me down. "Stop right there!" Richard bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He sprinted across the lobby and physically planted himself directly in front of the revolving glass exit doors, cutting off my only path to the street. "You are not walking away from me. You do not get to drop a delusional fantasy into the middle of my daughter's wedding and just stroll out like you own the place." I stopped walking, pulling Leo slightly behind my leg to shield him from his grandfather's irrational anger. "Move out of the way, Richard," I said, keeping my voice completely level. "The hotel manager already verified my account. Jamal already handed you the bank statements showing you drained a child's trust fund. The wedding is over. The charade is over." "You are lying!" Stephanie shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Jamal is just confused. You probably hired someone to forge those bank documents to ruin my life. And that black card is probably stolen. You are a broke, pathetic single mother. You live in a drafty shed. You do not own a $200 million tech company. You do not own anything." Diane stepped forward, crossing her arms over her sequined gown. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Your sister is right, Eleanor. This is just another one of your pathetic cries for attention. You have always been jealous of Stephanie. You could not handle the fact that she was marrying into a prestigious, wealthy, and powerful African American family from Chicago while you have absolutely nobody. So you stole a credit card and made up this insane story about buying our land. It is fraudulent and you are going to prison. I looked at the three of them. They were clinging to their manufactured reality with terrifying desperation. Even when faced with absolute proof, their superiority complex would not allow them to accept that the daughter they treated like garbage had outgrown their entire existence. Richard took a menacing step closer to me. He pointed his thick index finger right at my face. I know exactly who you are, Eleanor. You are the same worthless girl who stood crying in my kitchen exactly 7 years ago. Do you remember that night? Because I do. Connor had just dumped you. He left you with a newborn baby and $30,000 in credit card debt. You stood on my expensive hardwood floor, holding that crying kid in a cheap blanket, and you begged me for $200 so you could buy diapers and basic formula. Richard let out a cruel, barking laugh. He looked at the hotel guests gathering nearby, speaking loudly so everyone could hear my past humiliation. You got down on your knees and cried for diaper money. I put you in that unheated garden shed because it was exactly what you deserved for failing at your marriage. And now you expect me to believe that the girl who could not even afford baby food is suddenly a tech billionaire. You are nothing but a parasite. I did not break eye contact with my father. I let his harsh words hang in the air, absorbing the sheer malice of the man who was supposed to protect me. Then I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Richard's smug expression falter. You are absolutely right, Richard, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet lobby. 7 years ago, I stood in your kitchen with absolutely nothing. Connor took everything I had, and you refused to give your own grandson a single dollar for a meal. You threw us into that freezing shed with a leaking roof and a broken heater. You locked the door to the main house so I could not even use your kitchen to warm up a bottle. Diane scoffed. We were teaching you responsibility. You needed to learn how the real world works. Oh, I learned exactly how the real world works, Diane, I replied sharply. I learned that the only person I could rely on was myself. But here is the part of the story you completely missed while you were busy planning your country club dinners. While you thought I was sitting in that shed crying over my failed marriage, I was actually sitting on a concrete floor with a cheap, refurbished laptop. I was coding for 18 hours a day. I wrote thousands of lines of code while Leo slept in a plastic laundry basket next to me, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets to survive the winter draft. My fingers were literally numb from the cold, but I kept typing because I refused to let my son grow up depending on people like you. Richard rolled his eyes. Oh, please, you were playing on a computer. That does not make you a CEO. It does when that code becomes the foundation for Aegis data, I stated firmly, watching his face closely. That is the name of my flagship software, Richard. Aegis Data Analytics. Does that name sound familiar to you? Richard froze. His arms, which had been crossed defensively over his chest, slowly dropped to his sides. The furious red color drained out of his face, replaced by a sickly pale white. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Stephanie looked at her father, confused by his sudden silence. Dad, what is she talking about? What is Aegis Data? I will tell you what it is, Stephanie, I answered, never taking my eyes off my father. Aegis Data is the primary enterprise software that Richard's commercial real estate firm uses to process all of their global logistics, tenant background checks, and automated property valuations. Your father's firm signed an exclusive licensing contract with my company 3 years ago. I took a step forward, forcing Richard to take a step back. You pay a licensing fee of exactly $45,000 on the first of every single month, Richard. You authorized the upgrade to the premium tier last November. You have been personally funding the very empire you claim does not exist. The girl you threw in a shed is the vendor your entire business relies on to survive. You literally cannot operate your firm without my servers. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His hands began to tremble. The mathematical reality was finally overriding his massive ego. He realized that the anonymous corporate entity he had been sending massive checks to was fully owned and operated by the daughter he had abused for years. Diane looked from me to her husband, panic flashing in her eyes. Richard, tell her she is lying. Tell her your firm does not use her software. He cannot tell you that, Diane, I said, my tone dripping with absolute satisfaction. Because if he logs into his corporate dashboard right now, he will see the name Eleanor Williams listed as the Chief Executive Officer and sole proprietary owner of the software architecture. He just never bothered to read the fine print of the vendor contract. He never bothered to look at the name of the person he was paying because he was too busy stealing a college fund from a 7-year-old boy. Richard's breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He realized he was not just losing the land the shed sat on. He was standing face to face with the person who held the technological keys to his entire commercial real estate firm. I did not just have money, I had absolute leverage. The heavy silence in the hotel lobby was broken by the sound of Diane clearing her throat. I watched as my mother's brain rapidly processed the revelation. The hostility melted off her face, replaced instantly by a sickeningly sweet, calculating warmth. It was the exact same expression she used when she wanted a favor from the country club president or a free upgrade at a luxury boutique. "Eleanor, darling," Diane said, taking a step forward and attempting to reach for my arm. I pulled away sharply, keeping Leo securely behind me. She ignored the rejection, clasping her hands together against her chest, in a display of manufactured maternal affection. Let us just take a deep breath. Tensions are running high. Families fight, but at the end of the day, we are blood. And clearly you have done very well for yourself. We are so incredibly proud of you. I stared at her, repulsed by the sheer velocity of her hypocrisy. 10 minutes ago, she was calling me a curse and trying to slap me across the face. Now, because she smelled money, I was her darling daughter again. Since you own this software company, Diane continued, her eyes darting to the black card still sitting on the table, and you are clearly in a position of abundance. It only makes sense for you to help your sister. Jamal completely overreacted, but the vendors still need to be paid. The cancellation fees for the ballroom, the custom catering, the imported flowers, the photography crew. It totals around $300,000. Stephanie wiped her eyes, her greed temporarily overriding her devastation. She sniffled and stepped up beside our mother, regaining her arrogant posture. Exactly, Stephanie said. You ruined my wedding, Eleanor. You showed up and caused this massive drama. The least you can do is cover the invoices. 300 grand is pocket change for a tech founder. Just pay the hotel and clear the debt. If you do that, I might actually forgive you for ruining my life. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The absolute delusion required to make that statement was staggering. You want me to pay for a wedding that was funded by my son's stolen college trust, I stated clearly, making sure my voice carried across the space. You want me to bail you out after you stood on a stage and called me unwanted garbage in front of 300 people? The answer is no. I will not pay a single cent of your debt. You stole $150,000 from a 7-year-old boy. You can figure out how to pay the rest of the bill yourself. Richard's face hardened. The brief moment of intimidation he felt regarding my software company vanished, replaced by the vindictive patriarch who absolutely refused to be disobeyed by a subordinate. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out his smartphone. You have always been a stubborn, ungrateful brat, he growled, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. You think having a fancy company makes you untouchable. You think you can just walk in here, disrespect your family, and throw your weight around. You forgot one very important detail about how you set up your finances, Eleanor. My stomach tightened slightly as I watched him dial a number. He pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes locked onto mine with pure, unadulterated malice. I was calling Liberty National Bank, the primary financial institution our family had used for decades. Yes, this is Richard Williams, he said into the receiver, providing his elite account PIN to the automated system. Connect me to the VIP fraud department immediately. I need to report a critical emergency regarding a linked family account. I realized his angle instantly. 14 years ago, when I was a freshman in college, I suffered a severe medical emergency that left me hospitalized for a month. To manage my medical bills and process insurance claims, Richard had forced me to sign a custodial banking agreement. That document legally linked my primary Social Security number to his master portfolio, granting him status as a financial guarantor. When I built Novatech, I strictly separated my corporate assets. But my personal accounts, including the black Centurion card lying on the table, were still tethered to that ancient dormant legal link. I had never officially filed the paperwork to sever his custodial mandate because I simply had not thought about it in over a decade. My daughter is experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. Richard continued smoothly into the phone, playing the role of a distressed, concerned parent with terrifying perfection. She has stolen my corporate identity and is attempting to make fraudulent, massive charges at the Plaza Hotel. I am the primary legal custodian on her profile per the 2012 medical mandate. I need a total lockdown on her social security number. Freeze all of her assets and shut down that black card immediately. He listened for a moment, a cruel, satisfied smile spreading across his face. Thank you. Yes, I will provide the psychiatric hold paperwork to your legal department on Monday morning. Keep the freeze active indefinitely. Richard ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked at me with absolute arrogant triumph. You are not paying for anything tonight, Eleanor, he sneered. And you are not accessing a single dime of your little tech fortune either. Let us see how powerful you are when your pockets are completely empty. Welcome back to reality. Before I could even formulate a response, Mr. Caldwell, the hotel manager, returned to our table. He carried a sleek wireless credit card terminal on a silver tray. Completely unaware of the conversation that had just transpired, he picked up my black card with professional grace and slid the chip into the machine. I have tallied the total cancellation penalties and the property damages, Ms. Eleanor, Mr. Caldwell said politely. Processing the charge now. We all stood in tense silence. The terminal processed for 5 agonizing seconds. Then a sharp, angry red light flashed on the small digital screen. The machine emitted a loud, rejecting beep that seemed to echo in the quiet lobby. Mr. Caldwell frowned, pulling the card out and trying the magnetic strip instead. Another red light flashed. Another harsh beep sounded. Mr. Caldwell looked up, his professional demeanor slipping into slight, uncomfortable awkwardness. I apologize, Ms. Eleanor. The transaction has been declined by your financial institution. The system is showing that this account has been frozen and flagged for fraudulent activity. Richard crossed his arms, his chest puffing out with victorious pride. Diane let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, patting her husband's arm as if he had just saved them from a monster. And Stephanie, whose wedding was in absolute ruins just moments ago, looked at the red light on the credit card terminal and let out a bright, vicious laugh. She stepped right up to me, her tear-stained face twisting into a triumphant smirk. Looks like you are still just the broke loser from the garden shed, she whispered. You really thought you could win against us. Now take your bastard kid and get out of my sight before I call the real police. I looked at Stephanie, watching her triumphant smile stretch across her face. She stood there waiting for my tears. She wanted me to fall to my knees, beg for mercy, and apologize for humiliating them. She wanted the helpless girl from 7 years ago to come crawling back. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my laptop. What are you doing? Richard demanded. His victorious posture wavered slightly. You have no money. I just shut down your entire life. You are completely locked out. I placed the ultra-thin silver laptop directly on the marble table next to the flashing credit card terminal. I opened the screen. The facial recognition software scanned my features and instantly bypassed the lock screen. You shut down a legacy checking account from my college days, Richard, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the glowing screen. An account I have not actively used since I moved into your garden shed. I kept it open purely for sentimental reasons, but clearly that was a huge mistake. My fingers flew across the keyboard. 3 precise keystrokes. I bypassed the retail banking interface entirely and accessed the encrypted Novatech corporate treasury portal. You see, I continued, my voice echoing slightly in the vast lobby. When you build a financial data architecture that processes billions of dollars in international retail transactions, you do not rely on standard commercial banks to hold your primary liquidity. You certainly do not leave a backdoor open for a petty real estate broker to freeze your assets. I hit the enter key. A secure authorization protocol popped up on the display. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on the keyboard. Authorization confirmed, I announced. I just permanently revoked your custodial privileges across all global financial networks. You will never be able to run my social security number through a banking terminal ever again. And furthermore, I just wired the entire $300,000 cancellation fee directly from the Novatech corporate reserve. Mr. Caldwell looked down at his terminal. The angry red light vanished. A pleasant green light illuminated the screen, followed by a crisp chime. A long receipt began to print from the top of the machine. The transaction is approved and fully cleared. Ms. Eleanor, Mr. Caldwell stated, tearing off the receipt and handing it to me with a respectful bow. The balance is settled in full. Richard stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. Diane let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Stephanie stared at the green light on the terminal, her jaw practically hitting the marble floor. The illusion of their power over me shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I closed my laptop and slid it back into my bag. I picked up the receipt and handed it to Richard. "Keep this for your records," I told him, my tone completely void of emotion. "You are going to need it when you file for bankruptcy. Remember, you have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property." I took Leo's small hand in mine and turned toward the glass doors of the Plaza Hotel. Through the revolving exit, a massive matte black armored SUV pulled smoothly up to the curb. It was my private corporate transport. Two men in dark suits stepped out, opening the heavy reinforced doors and waiting at attention. "Wait!" Diane cried out, her voice cracking with sudden desperation. "Eleanor, please, we are your family. You cannot just leave us here with nothing. Where are you going?" "I am going home, Diane. To my real home, a place you will never ever see." I walked through the glass doors with my son. The security detail helped Leo into the spacious leather interior before closing the door behind me. The armored SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving my parents and my sister standing in the lobby, entirely consumed by the financial ruin they had brought upon themselves. I wrapped my arm around Leo as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. For the first time in my entire life, I took a deep breath of absolute unfiltered freedom. But parasites do not just give up when they lose their host. They mutate. They find a new way to draw blood. I woke up the next morning in the master suite of my penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow across the hardwood floors. It was peaceful. It was perfect. Then my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a rapid, continuous buzzing that signaled a digital avalanche. I picked up the device. I had over 400 missed calls, thousands of unread text messages, and an endless stream of social media notifications. My heart rate spiked. I tapped the screen and opened the first message from my lead public relations director at Novatech. The text read, "Eleanor, you need to look at this link right now. We have a massive crisis." I clicked the link. It opened a global social media platform. My screen filled with the tear-stained face of my sister Stephanie. She was sitting on the edge of a bed wearing a simple oversized sweater to look fragile and innocent. Her makeup was expertly smudged to give the illusion of a woman who had been crying all night. She looked directly into the camera, taking a trembling breath before speaking. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," Stephanie said, her voice shaking with manufactured trauma. "But I have to speak my truth. Yesterday was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. It was my wedding day. But it was completely destroyed by my own sister Eleanor." She paused to wipe a fake tear from her cheek. "Eleanor is deeply, deeply unwell," Stephanie continued, looking straight into the lens with wide, pleading eyes. "She has been mentally unstable for years. She has always been obsessed with my life, constantly trying to steal my happiness, because her own husband abandoned her. But yesterday, she crossed a line I can never forgive." My grip on the phone tightened. "Just hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle," Stephanie sobbed, "Eleanor cornered my fiancé, Jamal, in the bridal suite. She completely fabricated a story about my family stealing money. But that was not the worst part. She cornered him, she threw herself at him, and she tried to seduce my groom right before our wedding. She told him that if he did not cancel the wedding and leave with her, she would ruin his legal career with fake financial documents." I stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. The sheer audacity of the lie was suffocating. Jamal was so manipulated and traumatized by her psychotic behavior that he called off the wedding. Stephanie cried, burying her face in her hands. My sister is a dangerous, degenerate woman. She destroyed my family. She destroyed my future. Please, I just want my life back. I looked at the metrics below the video. It had been posted 3 hours ago. It already had 5 million views. The comments were a war zone of hatred directed entirely at me. People were calling for my arrest. They were calling me a monster, a homewrecker, a sociopath. Stephanie had successfully weaponized the internet, painting herself as the ultimate victim while portraying me as a deranged predator. She had unleashed a digital mob to destroy my reputation before I could even explain my side of the story. I stared at the screen, watching the view count on Stephanie's video climb by the thousands every single second. The digital mob was already sharpening their pitchforks, flooding my company's social pages and my personal inbox with vile threats. My public relations director was frantic, begging me to release a sanitized corporate statement to mitigate the fallout. I typed a single-word reply. Wait. I was not going to play defense against a manufactured scandal. But before I could formulate my exact counterstrike, my phone screen shifted to an incoming call. The caller ID read Hawthorne Preparatory Academy. It was the elite, ultra-exclusive private school where Leo was enrolled in the 2nd grade. I answered immediately, bracing myself for the inevitable. Ms. Williams. The voice of Headmaster Sterling trembled through the speaker. He was a man who usually projected absolute authority, but right now he sounded terrified. I am calling to inform you of a highly volatile situation on campus. We have a gathering of parents in the main courtyard. It is the Parent-Teacher Association Board, led by Beatrice Vance. They are demanding an emergency meeting regarding your son. My grip on the phone tightened. Beatrice Vance was my mother's doubles partner at the country club. Diane had clearly mobilized her suburban army. What exactly is the emergency, headmaster? They have seen the video, Eleanor. He lowered his voice, likely hiding in his office. They are threatening to pull their children and withdraw their annual endowment pledges unless Leo is immediately expelled. They are citing the moral turpitude clause in the parent contract. Beatrice is claiming that your presence endangers the emotional well-being of the other students. There are even a few local bloggers out front. I strongly advise you to keep Leo home today until this blows over. I felt a cold, dangerous calm settle over my entire body. They thought they could attack my son to punish me. They thought social pressure would force me into hiding. Leo is currently finishing his breakfast, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. I will be bringing him to school myself in exactly 20 minutes. Do not lock your doors, headmaster. I ended the call and walked into the dining room. Leo was happily eating his cereal, completely oblivious to the war being waged against his mother. I smiled at him, told him to grab his backpack, and escorted him down to the waiting armored SUV. I instructed my security team to drive directly to Hawthorne Preparatory. As we pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the school, the scene was exactly as Sterling had described. A barricade of luxury SUVs blocked the visitor parking lane. About 30 women draped in designer activewear and oversized sunglasses were clustered together in the manicured courtyard. They were practically vibrating with righteous indignation. A few people with smartphones attached to gimbals were live streaming the gathering, hoping to capture a piece of the viral drama. I told my driver to pull right up to the front curb, ignoring the designated drop-off zones. I turned to my lead security officer, a massive former Marine named Marcus. Escort Leo straight to his classroom, I instructed. Do not let anyone speak to him. I will handle the welcoming committee. I stepped out of the vehicle. The moment my heels hit the pavement, the courtyard fell dead silent. Every pair of eyes locked onto me. The silence lasted only a second before the whispering started escalating quickly into pointed, aggressive remarks. How dare you show your face here? Disgusting homewrecker. Think of the children, you sociopath. I ignored the noise, walking with deliberate, measured steps toward the massive oak doors of the main building. Before I could reach the entrance, Beatrice Vance stepped directly into my path. She was a tall, imposing woman who treated the PTA like her own personal dictatorship. She crossed her arms, flanked by 2 other angry mothers, forming a physical wall between me and the school. You are not walking in there, Eleanor Beatrice stated loudly, making sure the bloggers with their cameras could hear every word. Hawthorne Preparatory has strict ethical standards. We do not allow women of your depraved character to poison the environment of our children. Your sister called me this morning in absolute hysterics. We know exactly what you did to her. I stopped walking. I looked Beatrice up and down, letting the silence stretch until she shifted uncomfortably on her feet. Move out of my way, Beatrice, I said, keeping my tone conversational but laced with absolute authority. My son has a spelling test in 10 minutes and you are blocking the entrance. She scoffed, tossing her perfectly styled hair. Leo is no longer welcome here. The board has drafted a formal petition for his immediate expulsion. We will not expose our children to the offspring of a woman who tries to seduce her own family members for sport. Diane warned us you were unstable, but trying to steal your sister's groom on her wedding day is a new level of sickness. You are a danger to this community. Take your child and leave before we call the police for trespassing. The other mothers murmured in agreement, their faces twisted in disgust. They were relishing the drama, thrilled to have a real-world villain to destroy on a Tuesday morning. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive. I simply reached into my tailored jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I had printed it from my secure server right before leaving the penthouse. You want to talk about protecting the school's environment? Beatrice, I asked, holding the document up between us. You want to talk about morality and ethical standards. That is fascinating considering you are currently embezzling from the very PTA fund you claim to protect. Beatrice froze. The smug superiority vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden chalky paleness. What did you just say? She stammered, glancing nervously at the cameras pointing in our direction. That is slander. It is data, I corrected sharply. I run a global analytics firm, Beatrice. Did you really think you could use a shared community bank account to funnel $40,000 into a private shell company registered to your husband's failing landscaping business without leaving a digital footprint? I have the routing numbers, the timestamps, and the falsified vendor invoices right here. The mothers flanking. Beatrice slowly stepped away from her, their expressions turning from righteous anger to utter shock. The whispered insults directed at me suddenly stopped. I stepped closer to Beatrice, lowering my voice, so only she could hear the absolute promise of destruction in my words. You have exactly 10 seconds to disperse this pathetic mob, I whispered. You will march into Headmaster Sterling's office, you will withdraw your ridiculous petition, and you will resign as PTA president effective immediately. If you ever speak my name or my son's name again, I will send this entire financial dossier to the local authorities and the IRS. You will trade your country club membership for a federal indictment. Do we understand each other? Beatrice stared at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. The illusion of her moral high ground had been obliterated in less than a minute. She looked at the paper in my hand, then at the silent watching crowd of parents. She swallowed hard, giving me a single jerky nod. I stepped around her paralyzed frame, walked up the stone steps, and pushed open the heavy oak doors of Hawthorne Preparatory. The digital mob could scream all they wanted online, but I was going to systematically crush anyone who dared to bring that fight to my doorstep. After confirming with Headmaster Sterling that Leo's enrollment was absolute and that Beatrice Vance's petition was effectively dead, I walked back out through the heavy oak doors. The courtyard was entirely empty. Beatrice had scattered her suburban army like roaches fleeing a sudden light. I adjusted my tailored jacket and walked briskly down the stone path toward the visitor parking lane, where Marcus was waiting by the armored SUV. The morning air was crisp, and the adrenaline from the confrontation was just beginning to fade into a cold, focused clarity. But as I reached for the heavy steel door handle of my vehicle, a sharp, familiar voice called out my name. Eleanor, wait a minute. I turned around. Stepping out of the shadows of a sleek charcoal gray Aston Martin parked 2 spaces down was Jamal. He was no longer wearing the bespoke tuxedo from yesterday's disastrous non-wedding. Instead, he wore a razor-sharp custom navy suit that practically screamed corporate power. He looked completely unbothered by the fact that his ex-fiancée was currently sobbing to 5 million people on the internet. I signaled for Marcus to stand down, but keep a close, watchful eye. I crossed my arms, staring at the man who had almost married into my nightmare of a family. If you are here to confront me about Stephanie's viral video, Jamal, you are wasting your breath, I stated coldly, my guard instantly going back up. I did not ruin your wedding. Your bride's family ruined it by stealing from my son. If you want an apology or some kind of closure, you will not get it here. Jamal stopped a few feet away and let out a rich, genuine laugh. He shook his head, running a hand over his perfectly trimmed beard. Stephanie's video, he repeated, sounding genuinely amused. Please, Eleanor. I blocked Stephanie's number yesterday afternoon. Her little social media performance is entirely irrelevant to me. I already had my firm issue a cease and desist to her publicist regarding the use of my name. She is a sinking ship, and I do not tie myself to anchors. Then why are you ambushing me in my son's school parking lot? I demanded, my patience running dangerously thin. Jamal reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a heavy matte black business card and extended it toward me between his index and middle fingers. I took the card, looking down. The silver embossed lettering caught the morning sunlight. Vanguard Holdings, Lead Acquisitions Counsel, Jamal Hayes. I looked up at him, my mind rapidly recalibrating the situation. Vanguard Holdings was not just a company, they were a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, the absolute apex predators of the global tech industry. They had been aggressively trying to secure a meeting with my executive team at Novatech for the past 6 months, and I had repeatedly declined their inquiries. You are Vanguard's lead attorney, I said, keeping my face perfectly neutral despite the shock. That is why you were marrying Stephanie, to get close to me. Jamal smiled, leaning back against the hood of his Aston Martin with a relaxed posture. Not initially, no. I started dating Stephanie 2 years ago because she was beautiful and well-connected in the local commercial real estate scene. But 6 months ago, Vanguard initiated a deep dive into Novatech. We wanted to acquire the data architecture you built. During the due diligence phase, I was shocked to discover that the elusive, fiercely private founder and CEO of Novatech shared a last name with my future father-in-law. He crossed his arms, looking at me with absolute professional respect. It took me another week of intense digging to confirm that Eleanor Williams, the ghost of Silicon Valley, was actually Stephanie's estranged sister. I stared at him, letting the pieces fall into place. So you knew who I was yesterday, I said. When I walked into the ballroom and threw the black card on the table, you knew I had the capital to back it up. I knew exactly what you had, Jamal replied smoothly. Yesterday, when you dropped the bank statements proving Richard and Stephanie had committed felony fraud against your son, it gave me the perfect legal and public relations exit strategy. I could not tie myself or Vanguard Holdings to a family about to face severe federal indictments. You did me a massive favor, Eleanor. You handed me the scissors to cut the cord. I processed his words, analyzing the leverage he was presenting. You still want Novatech, I noted. You are here to leverage Stephanie's mess to force an acquisition meeting. Jamal held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. I am here to offer an alliance. The digital mob Stephanie sicked on you today is annoying, but it is just noise. Vanguard has the media infrastructure to crush her narrative by noon. We can release the actual police reports regarding Richard's fraud. We can completely bury her. In exchange, I just want 1 hour of your time to pitch a merger that will make us both incredibly wealthy. He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with a predatory corporate hunger. But here is the truly hilarious part of this entire circus, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. I sat at their dinner table for 2 years listening to them mock you. I listened to Diane call you a failure. I listened to Richard call you a broke single mother. They look at your company as some minor software hobby you play with in a garden shed. Jamal let out a low chuckle, shaking his head at the sheer absurdity of it all. They are running a smear campaign against you, completely oblivious to the fact that they have been actively bullying the youngest self-made tech billionaire in the state. They have absolutely no idea what kind of monster they just woke up. I looked down at the Vanguard Holdings card in my hand, feeling the heavy, expensive cardstock against my fingertips. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke across my face. Jamal was right. Stephanie and Richard were fighting a street brawl, completely unaware that I commanded a nuclear arsenal. Call your media team, Jamal, I said, looking back up at him. You have your meeting. Let us go bury my family. Hai gave a sharp, appreciative nod and fell into step right beside me. We walked back through the heavy oak doors of Hawthorne Preparatory Academy, trading the crisp morning air for the hushed, polished corridors of the elite private school. Our footsteps echoed in perfect unison against the imported marble floors. We did not need to ask the receptionist for directions. We simply followed the sound of the screeching. Down the main hall, emanating from the crack of the headmaster's double doors, Diane's voice was vibrating with unhinged entitlement. "I do not care about your procedural protocols," Arthur, my mother, barked. "I am personal friends with half the board of trustees. That woman is a menace to society. She is a degenerate who brings shame to this community. I want her bastard child pulled from his classroom, packed up, and removed from this property before the lunch bell rings. If you do not expel Leo Williams immediately, I will personally see to it that every single parent in my country club withdraws their tuition funding by tomorrow morning." I pushed the heavy doors wide open, not bothering to knock. The scene inside was chaotic. Headmaster Sterling was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, sweating profusely and dabbing his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. Diane was leaning over his desk, pointing a manicured finger right in his face. Stephanie was slouched in a leather guest chair, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, continuing her ridiculous victim performance. When the heavy doors hit the wall, all three of them snapped their heads toward the entrance. Diane's face contorted into a mask of pure hatred at the sight of me, but then her eyes shifted to my right. Stephanie actually gasped, dropping her tissue on the floor. "Jamal!" Stephanie cried out, leaping out of her chair. "You came! I knew you would not abandon me. I knew you would see through her lies. Please tell them what she did to us." Jamal did not flinch. He did not offer her a comforting smile. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his expensive navy suit and looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of a corporate executioner analyzing a bad asset. "I am not here for you, Stephanie," Jamal stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am here in my official capacity as lead acquisitions counsel for Vanguard Holdings. I am escorting my client, the Chief Executive Officer of Novatech, to ensure her son's educational environment remains undisturbed by fraudulent harassment." Stephanie froze as if she had been struck by lightning. Her arms, which had been reaching out for a hug, dropped limply to her sides. "Client," she repeated the words stumbling out of her mouth. "What are you talking about? She does not own a tech company. She lives in a shed." Jamal let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "It is truly remarkable how deeply committed you are to your own delusions, Stephanie. Eleanor's software architecture practically runs the modern logistics industry. Your entire family is bankrupt because your father tried to cross swords with a self-made billionaire. I suggest you sit down and remain very quiet before my legal team adds defamation to your impending list of federal charges." Diane recovered her voice, her face flushing an angry, violent shade of crimson. She marched toward Jamal, jabbing a finger in his direction. "How dare you speak to my daughter that way?" Diane shrieked. "You are just another manipulated pawn. You think you can walk into this school and intimidate us. I am a founding member of the Hawthorne Parent Association. Arthur, call the police right now. Remove this woman and her child from my sight." Headmaster Sterling finally stood up. He was a tall man, but he looked incredibly small behind his desk. He took a shaky breath, completely ignoring Diane, and looked directly at me. He bypassed my mother entirely and offered me a deep, respectful bow. "Ms. Williams, headmaster," Sterling said, his voice trembling but clear. "I want to sincerely apologize for this horrendous disturbance. Your security team successfully escorted Leo to his classroom, and I have personally assigned an administrative aide to ensure he is not bothered. He is perfectly safe and having a wonderful morning." Diane whipped her head around, staring at the headmaster as if he had just sprouted a second head. "What are you doing, Arthur? I told you to expel the boy. Do you want to lose your funding? Do you want me to call the board?" "You can call whoever you like," Diane, Headmaster Sterling replied, his posture finally straightening as he found his courage. "But the board will not take your call. In fact, your membership to the Parent Association has been revoked as of 10 minutes ago, pending an investigation into Beatrice Vance's financial irregularities." Stephanie grabbed her mother's arm, panic finally setting into her eyes. "Mom, what is he talking about?" "What I am talking about," the headmaster continued, looking Diane dead in the eye, "is that I could not expel Leo Williams even if I wanted to. Because his mother is not just a parent here, She is our primary benefactor. Diane let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Benefactor. She is a fraud. She stole a credit card. Headmaster Sterling shook his head, pulling a heavy leather portfolio from his desk drawer. Ms. Williams is the anonymous donor who finalized a $5 million charitable grant to Hawthorne Preparatory last week. Her capital is solely responsible for funding the new Advanced Robotics and Technology Complex we are breaking ground on next month. She practically owns the north wing of this campus. You do not dictate who attends this school, Diane. She does. The silence that followed was absolute. The reality of my wealth, my leverage, and my absolute control over the situation finally crashed down on them. Diane's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The superiority she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had been snapped in half. Stephanie sank back into the leather guest chair, burying her face in her hands as genuine terrified tears finally began to fall. I looked at the headmaster. Thank you for clarifying the situation, Arthur, I said smoothly. Now please have these trespassers removed from my son's school. Headmaster Sterling pressed a button on his intercom. Security, please come to the main office immediately. We have 2 unauthorized individuals who need to be escorted off the property. Within seconds, 3 burly security guards in dark uniforms stepped into the office. They did not ask questions. They simply grabbed Diane and Stephanie by their arms and physically hauled them toward the door. You cannot do this! Diane screamed, her heels dragging against the marble floor as she fought the guards. You are a monster, Eleanor. You are a curse on this family. You will pay for this. Stephanie wailed, trying to reach for Jamal one last time, but he simply turned his back on her, reviewing a document on his phone. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off their frantic, humiliating exit. I turned to Jamal. Shall we go to the boardroom to discuss that merger? He smiled, gesturing toward the door. After you, CEO. Outside in the bright sunlight of the visitor parking lot, Diane was roughly shoved onto the pavement by the security guards. She stumbled, scraping her knees against the concrete while Stephanie collapsed against the side of their rented sedan, sobbing uncontrollably. The elite mothers who had gathered in the courtyard earlier were now watching them from a distance, whispering and pointing their phones. Diane was completely ruined. Her social standing was ashes. But the humiliation did not bring her clarity. It only brought a toxic, unhinged rage. Diane stood up, brushing the dirt off her expensive skirt. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She ignored Stephanie's crying. She ignored the staring parents. She had only one goal left: total, mutually assured destruction. She scrolled through her contacts, finding a number she had not called in 7 years. She pressed dial and held the phone to her ear, her eyes wide and manic. The line rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered on the other end. Connor. Diane spat into the receiver, a wicked, desperate smile stretching across her face. It is Diane. I know it has been a long time, but I know where your ex-wife is, and more importantly, I know exactly where she is hiding all of your money. Diane's vindictive phone call to Connor was the desperate act of a drowning woman. I did not know she had made it until much later. At that exact moment, I was stepping into the private elevator that led to the executive floor of Novatech headquarters. Jamal and I spent the next 2 hours dissecting the Vanguard Holdings merger in my glass-walled boardroom. He was sharp, relentless, and entirely transactional. We spoke the exact same language. By the time he left my office, we had established the framework of a deal that would secure my company's autonomy while giving Vanguard the data architecture they desperately needed. I felt untouchable. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, looking out over the city skyline, finally breathing freely. Then the secure intercom on my desk buzzed. It was my executive assistant, Chloe. Her voice was tight with tension. Ms. Williams, there is a man in the main lobby demanding to see you. Security tried to escort him out, but he is causing a massive scene. He says he is your husband. My blood ran ice cold. Ex-husband, I corrected sharply. I am on my way down. I stepped off the elevator into the sprawling, minimalist lobby of Novatech. Standing near the reception desk, flanked by 2 of my security guards, was Connor. I was wearing a cheap off-the-rack suit that looked a size too small. His hair was slicked back in a desperate attempt to hide a receding hairline, and the heavy scent of cheap cologne wafted through the pristine air of my lobby. The charming, effortless grin that had fooled me a decade ago now just looked hollow, desperate, and predatory. He spotted me and threw his arms wide open, as if we were long-lost friends, reuniting after a brief vacation. "Eleanor," he shouted, his voice echoing off the Italian marble walls. "Look at you. Look at this magnificent place. You have really been holding out on me." I signaled the guards to stand back, but to stay within striking distance. I walked up to him, stopping exactly 3 feet away, giving him nothing but a wall of absolute freezing silence. "What are you doing here, Connor?" He dropped his arms, offering a wounded, boyish look that made my stomach turn. "Is that any way to greet the father of your child? I got a very interesting phone call from your mother this morning. Diane told me you have been hiding a massive fortune. She said you are a billionaire, Eleanor." Imagine my complete shock when I realized my ex-wife, the woman I thought was struggling to make ends meet in a tiny apartment, is secretly running a global tech empire. I stared at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "I am not hiding anything. I built this company from nothing. I built it after you walked out on me. Do you remember that day, Connor? Because I remember it vividly. I remember standing in a cramped, freezing apartment holding a screaming 2-week-old Leo. I remember looking into the closet and finding all your clothes gone. I remember the collection notices piling up from the $70,000 in credit card debt you secretly racked up in my name. You abandoned your newborn son to run off to Miami with a 22-year-old receptionist. You left us to starve. I scrubbed floors and wrote code at 3 in the morning to pay off your debts." Connor scoffed, waving a hand dismissively, as if I had just brought up a minor disagreement over a restaurant bill. "We were young, Eleanor. People make mistakes." I panicked. Fatherhood was overwhelming. But I am here now. I am completely ready to step up and be a real father to Leo. We are family. We should be sharing this incredible success together. "You do not care about Leo," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You did not even send him a single birthday card for 7 years. You do not even know what his favorite color is. You are only here because Diane told you I have money. You are a parasite looking for a quick payday. Leave this building right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." Connor's fake, accommodating smile vanished in an instant, replaced by the ugly, resentful sneer I remembered so vividly from the bitter end of our marriage. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slammed it down on the reception desk with a loud smack. "I am not going anywhere," he snarled, leaning aggressively into my personal space. "Those are court documents, Eleanor. I just filed an emergency petition for full legal and physical custody of Leo." I looked at the envelope, then back at him, feeling a sudden dangerous spike of adrenaline. "You have absolutely no legal grounds for custody. You formally abandoned him. A judge will throw you out of court." "I have a very compelling narrative," Connor countered, tapping the envelope with a dirty fingernail. "I saw Stephanie's video online this morning. 5 million views and counting. The whole internet thinks you are a deranged, unstable homewrecker who preys on her own family. Diane sent me a list of parents from Leo's school who are more than willing to testify that your presence is a danger to their community. You are a pariah, Eleanor." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "I have an exclusive interview scheduled with a major national daytime talk show tomorrow morning. They are dying for a follow-up to Stephanie's viral video. Imagine what happens to Novatech's stock price. Imagine what happens to your precious Vanguard Holdings merger when the heartbroken, loving father goes on national television crying about how his billionaire ex-wife alienated him from his only son. I will tell them you are mentally unfit. I will tell them you locked me out of Leo's life using your vast wealth and corporate lawyers to bully me. The media will eat you alive." He crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug, entirely convinced he had me trapped. "The court of public opinion has already convicted you, Eleanor. A family court judge will take one look at the media circus surrounding you, look at the testimony from your own mother and sister, and hand Leo right over to me. Unless, of course, we come to a private, out-of-court financial settlement today." I think $20 million is a very fair price for me to drop the custody suit, cancel the interview, and disappear back to Miami forever. I looked at Connor. He really thought he had won. He really thought he could stroll into my empire, threaten my child, and extort me, using the pathetic ammunition my mother had handed him. I did not see a threat standing in front of me. I saw a hostile takeover bid based entirely on fraudulent assets, and I knew exactly how to dismantle it. I looked at Connor's smug, punchable face. He stood in my pristine corporate lobby wearing a suit that looked like he had bought it off a discount rack 5 years ago. He was trying to project power, but his nervous energy betrayed him. He was a desperate man playing a dangerous game. $20 million, I repeated, letting the number hang in the cold, air-conditioned space. You really believe you have that kind of leverage, Connor? You cannot even afford a decent attorney. A high-profile custody battle in state court will bankrupt whatever miserable life you have scraped together. You do not have the capital to fight me. Connor smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. I do not have to pay the legal fees, Eleanor. I found some very generous financial backers who are extremely invested in seeing Leo placed in a stable, traditional household. Right on cue, the heavy revolving glass doors of the Novatech building spun. My security guards instantly shifted their stances as three familiar figures marched into the lobby: Richard, Diane, and Stephanie. They walked in a tight formation, projecting a united front of absolute arrogance. Richard was wearing his best country club blazer, trying to look like a man of authority rather than a bankrupt fraudster. Diane held her chin high, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her grip. Stephanie trailed slightly behind them, her eyes red and puffy, but a venomous smile was slowly creeping across her face. They marched right up to Connor, aligning themselves beside him. The Parasite Alliance was officially formed. Hello, Eleanor. Diane said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. We decided to accompany Connor today. We felt he needed moral support during such a difficult legal transition. I stared at my mother, feeling a profound sense of disgust. You mean you needed a new weapon? I countered. Beatrice Vance lost her PTA presidency this morning, and Jamal walked away from your disastrous family to do business with me. You are completely out of options. You have no money, no leverage, and no social standing left. So you dug up the man who abandoned your grandson, hoping you could use him to extort me. Stephanie stepped forward, her hands balled into fists. You took my wedding, Eleanor. You took my future and humiliated me in front of the entire city. Now we are taking the only thing you actually care about. Connor is Leo's biological father. He has rights. He lost those rights the day he left a 2-week-old baby to starve, I stated, my voice echoing sharply off the marble floors. The family court will decide that, Richard interjected, puffing out his chest and attempting to look intimidating. And judges rely heavily on character witnesses when determining custody. Connor has 3 very credible, upstanding members of the community ready to testify under oath on his behalf. Diane unzipped her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. We have spent the entire morning with Connor's attorneys. We have signed sworn affidavits, Eleanor. We have detailed your long history of mental instability. We have outlined your erratic behavior, your aggressive outbursts, and your complete inability to provide a nurturing environment for Leo due to your obsessive, unhealthy commitment to your company. I looked at the paperwork in her hands, a chilling realization washing over me. You are willing to commit perjury, I said, maintaining absolute emotional detachment. You would stand up in a court of law and swear to malicious lies to take a child away from his mother. You would hand Leo over to a man who drained my bank accounts and ran away with another woman just to punish me for cutting off your credit cards. We are doing what is best for our grandson, Diane said, not flinching for a single second. A growing boy needs a real family. He does not need a sociopath who destroys her sister's wedding day and evicts her own parents from their home. We are protecting him from your toxicity. The sheer hypocrisy of her statement was suffocating. These were the people who had mocked my late nights, who had belittled my ambitions, and who had gleefully spent the money I generated while treating me like the hired help. They did not care about Leo's well-being. They had barely acknowledged his existence for the past 7 years, unless it served their social agenda. Now they were weaponizing my son to force a payout. They had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. Stephanie laughed a vicious, ugly sound that bounced off the glass walls. The media is going to love this narrative, Eleanor. The cold, calculating billionaire CEO who neglects her child. When we take the stand, we will paint a picture so devastating the board of directors at Novatech will be forced to remove you. Vanguard Holdings will run for the hills. You will lose your company, your reputation, and you will lose Leo. Connor stepped forward, clapping his hands together slowly, clearly enjoying the theatrical performance. So you see the predicament you are in, Elle. We have the witnesses, we have the narrative, we have the media on standby. A prolonged court battle will drag your company through the mud and traumatize the kid. But I am a reasonable man. I am a businessman just like you. You are an extortionist, I corrected him coldly. Call it whatever helps you sleep at night. Connor shrugged, leaning his elbows against the sleek reception desk. But the price has changed. Seeing as I have to compensate my excellent character witnesses for their time and emotional distress, the $20 million is off the table. Here is the new deal. You wire $2 million directly into a secure offshore account that my lawyer has set up. Clean, untraceable cash for me to start a new life. He pointed a finger toward Stephanie. And you completely pay off the $300,000 debt your sister is carrying from the wedding you ruined. You clear their books and you pay me. And if I refuse, I asked, keeping my tone deadly and flat. If you refuse, I file the emergency custody injunction tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Connor stated, a greedy glint in his eyes. Diane, Richard, and Stephanie will release their affidavits to the press simultaneously. We will drag you through a media circus that will absolutely shatter Novatech's stock price. We will take Leo, and we will take your empire down with you. But if you pay the $2.3 million today, I will sign away my parental rights forever. I will disappear back to Florida, and your family will sign strict non-disclosure agreements, promising to never speak of you or your company again. You buy your peace, Eleanor. It is a bargain. I looked at the four of them standing there in my lobby. They were so incredibly confident. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a pathetic syndicate of greed and entitlement. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They thought my wealth made me a soft target, a limitless bank they could endlessly withdraw from through fear and intimidation. They assumed my maternal instincts would override my logic. They expected me to fall to my knees, panic at the thought of losing Leo to the foster system, or a dragged-out court battle, and quickly write a check to sweep the impending scandal completely out of sight. What they failed to realize was that they had just walked into the headquarters of a data analytics empire and openly confessed to a crime. They had just escalated a petty suburban family dispute into a coordinated, documented conspiracy to commit federal extortion. They had marched onto my territory and handed me the exact rope I needed to hang them all. I did not scream. I did not call for my security team to physically throw them onto the street. Instead, I let a calm, clinical smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that made Richard shift nervously, his false bravado faltering for just a fraction of a second. Connor, I said, gesturing smoothly toward the private executive elevator bank. If we are going to discuss a multi-million-dollar transaction regarding the custody of my son, we are not doing it in the lobby. We will do it in my office. Diane, Richard, Stephanie, you should all come upstairs. I want every single one of you to fully understand the exact terms of our negotiation. They exchanged triumphant glances. In their greedy, narrow minds, my invitation upstairs was a white flag. They thought I was capitulating to avoid a scene. Connor puffed out his chest, buttoning his cheap jacket, and led the parade into the glass elevator. The ride up to the penthouse floor was thick with their smug silence. Stephanie was already looking around the opulent building, practically redecorating my headquarters in her head with the money she thought she was about to extort from me. We stepped into my office. It was a massive, sweeping space overlooking the city, dominated by a sleek, black polished desk and an array of high-definition monitors. I walked around to my leather executive chair and sat down. I did not offer them a seat. They stood awkwardly in a semicircle in front of me, like employees waiting for a performance review. So Connor began, leaning his hands flat on my desk, trying to project dominance. $2.3 million. We can have your legal team draft the non-disclosure agreements right now. Just wire the funds and this entire nightmare goes away for you. I kept my eyes fixed on him as my fingers glided across my keyboard. Novatech is not just a standard software company, Connor. I said, my voice eerily quiet in the large room. We build predictive behavioral models. We map global financial ecosystems and identify microscopic anomalies in data flows for international banks. We catch the things that human auditors miss. I hit the enter key. I took hold of my massive curved primary monitor and swiveled it around so the screen faced the four of them. Because I build these systems. I continued leaning back in my chair. I have access to the most sophisticated financial tracking algorithms on the planet. And the very second my mother called your phone this morning, I had my lead security analyst run a complete digital diagnostic on Connor Hayes. Connor stared at the screen. The smugness drained from his face so fast, it looked as though the blood had been physically siphoned from his body. On the monitor was a complex web of data nodes highlighted in bright flashing red. Data does not lie. Connor, I stated, pointing at the cascading numbers. You are not here because you suddenly developed a conscience and want to be a father to Leo. You are here because you are currently $1.8 million in debt to an illicit sports betting syndicate operating out of a warehouse in Miami. The software tracked your offshore routing numbers. It tracked the aggressive high-interest loans you took out to cover your losses. Diane gasped, taking a step away from Connor as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. Stephanie stared at the screen, her jaw dropping as she realized her precious $300,000 bailout was evaporating before her eyes. But that is not even the best part, I said, my voice hardening into steel. The really interesting data points are the ones showing where you have been getting the money to make your minimum interest payments. You have been systematically embezzling funds from your own clients at your financial firm for the past 8 months. You have been forging transfer signatures to funnel their money into shell companies to keep the loan sharks off your back. And according to your firm's public calendar, their annual third-party audit begins next Tuesday. Connor stood completely paralyzed. His mouth opened but no words came out. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows listening to the lever being pulled. You do not have a compelling narrative for the media, I told him, standing up from my desk. You are a desperate cornered rat facing 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. If you step foot in a family court, a judge will not just throw out your custody petition, they will have you arrested in the courtroom. I walked around the desk, standing inches away from his trembling frame. You thought you had leverage, I whispered. You walked into one of the most secure data-reliant facilities in this state and conspired to extort a chief executive officer. I have the lobby audio and video recordings of your exact demands. I have your complete digital footprint. I am not paying you $2 million. I am not paying Stephanie a single dime. I turned my gaze to Diane and Richard, who were completely frozen in shock. Your master plan failed, I told my parents. You brought a criminal into my building to threaten my son. I looked back at Connor. You have until 5 o'clock today to formally withdraw your custody petition. If that document is not shredded by the time I leave this office, I am sending this entire data packet directly to the FBI field office in Miami, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the men you owe money to. Now get out of my building before I have my security team throw you through the plate glass windows. Connor stumbled backward, his face slick with cold sweat. He did not say a word. He turned and practically ran out of the office. Richard, Diane, and Stephanie scrambled after him, their pathetic extortion ring completely shattered by undeniable hard data. I stood alone in my office watching the elevator doors close on them. I had stripped away their last shred of leverage. I had backed them all into a corner from which there was no legal or social escape. But I underestimated the terrifying lengths desperate people will go to when they have nothing left to lose. 3 days passed in relative silence. The custody petition was formally withdrawn just as I demanded. The media noise from Stephanie's video was quickly buried by a brilliant counter-campaign orchestrated by Vanguard Holdings. The narrative shifted, painting Novatech as a resilient female-led powerhouse that refused to bow to petty family drama. I thought the war was finally over. Then I received a certified letter delivered directly to my private penthouse. It was a formal request for a mediation settlement. The letter stated that Diane, Richard, Stephanie, and Connor were prepared to sign ironclad lifetime non-disclosure agreements, legally binding themselves to never contact me or Leo again. They claimed they wanted to surrender completely and walk away. But the letter stipulated that the documents had to be signed in person, overseen by a neutral arbiter to ensure no future legal loopholes could be exploited. They requested a meeting at a private, highly exclusive dining club located on a secluded coastal road 30 miles outside the city limits. A place called the Obsidian Room. It felt like a standard final legal formality. I wanted them permanently erased from my life, so I agreed. But when my driver pulled up to the isolated, dimly lit restaurant nestled against the foggy coastline, there were no valets waiting. The parking lot was entirely empty save for 3 black, heavily tinted vans. I stepped inside the grand foyer. It was completely silent. There was no hostess, no neutral legal arbiter, and no sign of my family. Instead, standing in the shadows of the main dining room, blocking the only exit, were 5 large men in dark leather jackets. And standing behind them, his face bruised and his eyes wild with sheer terror, was Connor. This was not a legal mediation. It was a trap. Connor had brought the Miami Underground directly to me. I stood in the doorway, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a muted click, sealing me inside. The 5 men in leather jackets did not move. They were muscle-hired hands meant to intimidate. Connor looked like he was about to vomit. He had clearly borrowed money from these men, and this was his desperate play to pay them back using my blood. But the real shock was not the thugs. It was the table in the center of the dimly lit dining room. Sitting beneath a single dramatic chandelier were my parents and my sister. They were sipping red wine as if they had just finished a pleasant seafood dinner. Diane was adjusting her diamond necklace. Richard looked aggressively comfortable. Stephanie was practically vibrating with malicious glee. I walked forward, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The echo was the only sound in the cavernous, empty restaurant. I reached the table and looked down at the documents laid out next to Richard's wine glass. Richard leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. He nodded toward the leather-bound folder. "Have a seat, Eleanor. We have some paperwork to finalize." I did not sit. "You rented out an entire coastal restaurant and hired Miami enforcers for a family mediation," I stated, keeping my voice deadpan. "You are truly out of your minds." Diane took a delicate sip of her wine. "We are simply taking precautions, darling. You have become incredibly difficult to manage. You refused Connor's very reasonable settlement, so we had to escalate." I glanced at the papers. The top sheet was a total transfer of Novatech voting shares to a holding company controlled by Richard, alongside a blank check authorization and a full custody surrender of Leo to Connor. It was laughable in its illegality. No judge would ever validate a document signed under duress, let alone one drafted by a cartel. But these people were beyond logic. They were blinded by pure toxic greed. Richard tapped a gold pen against the table. "Sign it, Eleanor," he demanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, guttural register I had rarely heard. "This family has no room for defiance. You have humiliated us for the last time. You will not walk out of those doors tonight unless your signature is on every single page." I looked at the man who was supposed to be my father. "You are threatening your own daughter with physical violence to steal her money. You stopped being our daughter the moment you decided to hoard your billions while we faced bankruptcy." Diane spat, her elegant mask finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "We raised you. We fed you. We allowed you to live under our roof. Everything you have belongs to us. You owe us your success." "You were always the stubborn one," Diane continued, standing up and leaning across the table. "The difficult child. You never fit in, Eleanor. You lacked Stephanie's grace, my charm, your father's business acumen. You were a disappointment. And then by some sheer stroke of dumb luck, you stumble into a fortune and you refuse to share it. You watched us struggle. You watched me lose my position at the Hawthorne Academy. You watched your sister cry over her canceled wedding, and you did nothing. You are a monster." Stephanie leaned across the table, her eyes wide and manic. "You ruined my life, Eleanor. You took Jamal away from me. You made me a laughingstock. Now you are going to pay for it. Connor owes these gentlemen a lot of money. When you sign those papers, his debts are cleared. I get my wedding money back. Mom and Dad save their country club status, and you get to walk out of here with your life. It is basic economics. Connor wiped his sweating forehead. Just sign it, Elle. Please, these guys do not play around. They will hurt you. They will hurt Leo. Just give them the money. I did not show an ounce of fear. I slowly looked at the 5 men standing by the door, then back to my family. You brought violent criminals into a dispute involving your own grandson, Diane. You are willing to put Leo in the hands of a degenerate gambler just to secure a payout. You have absolutely no soul. Richard slammed his fist on the table, rattling the wine glasses. Do not lecture us on morality. You are a selfish, hoarding sociopath. We gave you every opportunity to handle this quietly. But you forced our hand. We had to make an arrangement with Connor's associates to ensure you took us seriously. On arrangement, I repeated, a dry laugh escaping my lips. You honestly believe these men are going to let you walk away with millions of dollars? You think you can control a Miami loan shark syndicate, Richard? You are a failed suburban real estate developer. You are entirely out of your depth. I will be taking over the CEO position at Novatech effective tomorrow morning, Richard announced with absolute delusion, completely ignoring my warning. With Connor handling the custody arrangements, you will have no legal standing to interfere. I have already drafted the press release. I will explain that you suffered a complete mental breakdown and stepped away for your own health. The board will welcome a steady, experienced male hand at the wheel. They had lost their minds. They had completely disconnected from reality. They thought a signed piece of paper in an abandoned restaurant backed by hired thugs would magically transfer a global technology corporation into their hands. They thought they could simply erase me and claim my empire as their own. The sheer magnitude of their entitlement was breathtaking. They were perfectly willing to let organized crime brutalize their own flesh and blood just to maintain their country club memberships. Sign the papers, Eleanor, Richard repeated, stepping closer. The 5 men in the back of the room shifted, taking a synchronized step forward. The threat was no longer implied. It was immediate and physical. Pick up the pen, Richard commanded. You have exactly 1 minute before I tell Connor's friends that negotiation has concluded, and they can use whatever methods they deem necessary to extract your signature. I let the heavy silence stretch across the dimly lit dining room. The 5 men in leather jackets stepped closer, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor in a synchronized, intimidating rhythm. Connor was practically hyperventilating in the corner, terrified of the very muscle he had brought to threaten me. I looked at the gold pen resting on the pristine white paper. Then I looked at my mother, who was watching me with the cold, detached gaze of an executioner. I let my shoulders collapse. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I channeled every ounce of exhaustion from the past few days, allowing my eyes to well up until a single perfectly timed tear spilled over my lower lash line and tracked slowly down my cheek. You would really do this, I whispered, making my voice tremble with manufactured defeat. You would let them hurt me. You would let them near your own grandson. Diane scoffed, taking a delicate sip of her red wine. We are simply correcting a mistake, Eleanor. You brought this entirely on yourself by being so selfish. We asked nicely. We gave you a chance to settle this like civilized people, but you had to be difficult. You always have to be difficult. Richard pushed the stack of documents closer to me, his face an ugly mask of triumph. 50 seconds, he stated, his voice devoid of any paternal warmth. Stop the theatrics and sign the papers. I let out a choked sob, burying my face in my hands for a brief moment. It was the exact performance they wanted. They needed to see me broken. They needed to feel superior to believe that their brute force had successfully shattered my independence. I reached out with a visibly shaking hand and picked up the heavy gold pen. It felt cold against my skin. I looked down at the transfer of Novatech voting shares. It was a legally laughable document drafted by someone who clearly did not understand corporate governance or securities law, but that did not matter right now. What mattered was the illusion of compliance. If I sign this, I said, looking up at Richard with wide, fearful eyes, you promise they will not touch me. You promise Connor leaves Leo out of this. Connor nodded eagerly from the background, his face slick with sweat. Just sign it, Elle. Please, nobody has to get hurt today. Richard tapped the signature line impatiently. I placed the tip of the pen on the paper. With deliberate trembling strokes, I signed my name. I flipped to the next page. The blank check authorization handing over direct access to my personal offshore accounts. Signed. I flipped to the final page. The full custody surrender granting Connor immediate physical and legal rights to my son. Signed. I pushed the stack of papers back across the polished wood table. Richard snatched them up immediately. His eyes scanned my signatures with ravenous hunger, his fingers tracing the ink to ensure it was real. A sickeningly triumphant, arrogant grin broke across his face. He looked at Diane and nodded. Before Richard could even stack the papers neatly into his leather portfolio, Stephanie was already moving. She pulled a compact lighting ring from her designer purse, clipped it to her smartphone, and tapped the screen with manic energy. The harsh, bright LED light illuminated her face as she framed the shot to include me sitting slumped and defeated at the table in the background. Hey everyone, Stephanie cooed into the camera, instantly adopting her sugary victimhood persona. I know I have been quiet since my wedding was so tragically ruined, but I promised you all an update, and the truth always prevails. She angled the phone so her followers could clearly see the fake tears drying on my cheeks. As you can see, we are having a family intervention today. My sister Eleanor has finally realized the extent of the damage she has caused to our family. She has confessed to everything. She just legally surrendered her company, and more importantly, she has agreed to give full custody of her son back to his loving biological father. Stephanie paused, checking the viewer count, climbing rapidly on her screen, her smile widening into something truly predatory. It took a lot of tough love, she continued, lowering her voice to sound sympathetic, but she finally admitted she is mentally unfit to run Novatech or raise a child. We are just so relieved to finally have peace and to get our family back on track. Thank you all for your support. Richard ignored Stephanie's digital vanity project. He was too busy staring at the documents that he believed had just made him a billionaire. He signaled to one of the men in the shadows. The thug stepped forward and uncorked a bottle of vintage champagne that had been chilling in a silver bucket near the bar. The loud pop of the cork echoed like a gunshot in the empty restaurant. Richard poured 4 glasses, completely bypassing me. He handed one to Diane, one to Stephanie, who briefly lowered her phone to take it, and one to Connor, who accepted the crystal flute with a violently shaking hand. To the natural order of things, Richard announced, raising his glass high, his chest puffed out with unearned pride. To family loyalty, and to the new era of Novatech under proper competent management. Diane clinked her glass against his, her diamond bracelets catching the light of the chandelier. To getting our lives back, she added, looking down at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. You finally did something useful for this family, Eleanor. Try to find some peace in that. Stephanie held her champagne glass up to her phone camera for her thousands of live viewers to see. Cheers to truth and justice, everyone. They drank. They tipped their heads back and swallowed the expensive champagne, celebrating their supposed victory, completely intoxicated by their own greed and the belief that they had successfully crushed me into submission. They laughed, a chorus of cruel mocking sounds that filled the secluded dining room. I remained silent in my chair. I kept my head bowed, my hands resting limply in my lap, playing the role of the vanquished, terrified daughter to absolute perfection. Let them drink. Let them gloat. Let Stephanie broadcast their victory to the entire internet. They had no idea that they had just documented their own crimes. They had no idea that my security team had pinged my location the second the tinted vans surrounded my car, or that the signature on those legally binding documents did not match the biometric authorization required by my corporate bylaws. They thought they had backed a desperate woman into a corner. They did not realize they had just locked themselves inside a cage with an apex predator. I reached up and carefully wiped the single tear from my cheek. My hand stopped shaking. My posture straightened. The trembling, defeated victim vanished in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating architect who had just watched her blueprint execute flawlessly. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Richard stopped mid-laugh. His champagne flute hovered inches from his mouth, the golden liquid swaying dangerously close to the rim. He frowned, his thick brows knitting together as he glanced at Diane, then back at me. "What exactly is so amusing, Eleanor?" he demanded, his tone losing its triumphant edge. I did not look at him. I looked past him toward the shadows near the back bar where the quiet staff member had been standing all evening. "You can stop pouring now, Agent Miller," I said, my voice cutting through the thick celebratory atmosphere like a surgical blade. The waiter, who had just served them their victory champagne, stepped forward into the warm light of the chandelier. He placed the expensive vintage bottle on the polished mahogany bar. With calm, methodical movements, he untied his black apron and let it drop to the floor. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold shield. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Richard froze completely. The color drained from Diane's face so rapidly she looked as though she had seen a ghost. Stephanie let out a confused, high-pitched gasp. Her phone still held aloft, broadcasting every second of her mounting confusion to her live audience. Before any of them could process the meaning of the badge, the heavy double doors leading to the kitchen slammed open. A dozen heavily armed tactical officers flooded into the dining room, their boots stomping against the hardwood floor. They moved with terrifying precision, their weapons drawn, and aimed squarely at Connor's hired muscle. The Miami thugs were seasoned enough to know when a job was completely dead. They did not even attempt to reach for their concealed weapons. They dropped to their knees, placing their hands on their heads without a single word of protest, instantly surrendering to the federal sting. But the police tactical unit was not the main event. Walking right behind the heavily armed agents dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit and radiating absolute unquestionable authority was Jamal. Stephanie let out a strangled, breathless cry. "Jamal," she gasped, lowering her phone slightly as her eyes widened in pure shock. "What are you doing here?" He did not look at her. He looked directly at me and gave a brief, respectful nod of acknowledgement. I turned my attention back to my family, relishing the sheer, unadulterated terror that was finally radiating from them. "You thought you rented out an abandoned, secluded restaurant," I explained, leaning forward and resting my elbows confidently on the table. "You thought you found a discreet location off the grid where you could commit your crimes in peace. You are absolute fools. Novatech owns this property through a subsidiary shell corporation. We acquired it 6 months ago to build a new executive retreat. For the past 48 hours, federal agents have been actively wiring this entire room." I pointed gracefully to the crystal chandelier hanging directly above us. "Audio receivers." I pointed to the elegant floral centerpieces scattered across the dining tables. "Micro cameras." I looked directly into Stephanie's phone lens, giving her viewers a sharp, triumphant look. "And thank you, Stephanie, for broadcasting your extortion attempt to thousands of witnesses in real time. Your live stream just provided the federal prosecutors with perfectly synced, high-definition supplementary evidence." Stephanie shrieked and fumbled with her device, frantically jabbing at the screen to end the broadcast, but her hands were shaking too violently. The phone clattered onto the floor, the screen cracking against the wood, the camera still capturing the ornate ceiling and the frantic, echoing audio of her complete panic. "This is entrapment!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with desperate fear, as 2 federal officers grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. "You set us up, Eleanor. We were just negotiating a private family dispute. We did not do anything wrong. You brought armed men across state lines to extort a chief executive officer and threaten the physical safety of a child," Agent Miller stated, stepping forward with a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. "That is federal extortion conspiracy to commit kidnapping and racketeering. The documents on that table are physical evidence of your criminal intent to defraud." "But I signed them," I said, my smile widening into a predatory grin. "And you should know, Richard, that Novatech's corporate charter requires multi-factor biometric authorization for any transfer of voting shares. A simple signature on a piece of paper handed over in a restaurant is legally worthless. You extorted me for garbage. You traded your freedom for an illusion." Connor suddenly broke away from the table, making a desperate, pathetic dash toward the front doors. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 tactical officers lunged forward, tackling him and slamming him hard into the floor. The sound of his breath leaving his lungs echoed loudly. They hauled him up roughly, his arms twisted behind his back, and clamped the cuffs onto his wrists. He began sobbing hysterically, begging the agents for a deal, offering to testify against my parents in exchange for immunity. His manufactured bravado dissolved the second he faced real, unavoidable consequences. Diane was hyperventilating, clutching her diamond necklace as a female officer firmly read her Miranda rights. Richard was shouting wildly about his lawyers, his face purple with rage, humiliation, and the sudden realization that his suburban empire was gone forever. They were scrambling desperately, trying to find an exit, a legal loophole, a way to spin this disaster into another victory. Stephanie, completely ignoring her arrested parents, lunged toward Jamal. Her tears were genuine this time, born of pure self-preservation. "Jamal, please," she begged, reaching out to grab the lapels of his suit jacket. "You know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. Eleanor manipulated us into doing this. She drove us crazy with her greed. Please, you have to tell them to let me go. We used to be in love. You cannot let them take me to jail." Jamal took a deliberate step back, easily avoiding her grasping hands. His expression was entirely devoid of sympathy or lingering affection. He looked at her not with anger, but with absolute clinical disgust. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the floor right next to her shattered broadcasting phone. "You should be worrying about much more than just federal extortion today," Stephanie, Jamal said, his voice echoing with brutal finality. "That folder contains the massive commercial loan application you submitted yesterday morning to my family's private bank. You requested $4 million to launch your new lifestyle brand." Stephanie froze entirely, her eyes darting nervously from Jamal's hard face to the folder resting on the floor. "I personally reviewed the application this morning." Jamal continued, stepping closer so she could hear every single word over the chaotic noise of the arrests. "It was a very thorough and detailed application. The only problem is the primary guarantor section on the final page. You forged my signature, Stephanie. You tried to leverage my family's bank and my personal credit history to fund your vanity project." Stephanie let out a ragged, suffocating gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth as the ultimate trap snapped shut around her. "That is federal bank fraud," Jamal stated, turning to address the FBI agent securing the room. "Adding that to the extortion and racketeering charges, you are looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." The air violently rushed out of Stephanie's lungs. The federal agents did not wait for her to formulate a pathetic, weeping excuse. They read her rights, clamped the cold steel cuffs around her wrists, and marched her out of the restaurant alongside my parents. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated their absolute, undeniable ruin. It took them 4 days to post bail. Richard had to liquidate his remaining highly penalized retirement portfolios and take out a brutal high-interest loan against a suburban house that was already heavily underwater. They narrowly avoided a holding cell, but the extortion charge was only the preamble to their nightmare. The real guillotine hanging over their heads was the bank fraud. To salvage her collapsing social status and maintain the illusion of extreme wealth, Stephanie had acted with breathtaking recklessness. She had used Jamal's private banking credentials, which she had secretly memorized during their engagement, to forge a massive commercial loan application. She had already drawn down $1 million of hot cash, funneling it into a shell account to pay for designer clothes, a luxury car lease, and an expensive public relations firm to manage her online brand. Now Vanguard Holdings, the massive financial institution owned by Jamal's family, had summoned them to their corporate headquarters in Chicago. It was a mandatory compliance meeting before the bank officially handed their internal fraud investigation over to the Department of Justice. You would think facing a decade in a federal penitentiary would humble a person. You would be completely wrong. As Richard, Diane, and Stephanie walked through the revolving glass doors of the towering Vanguard Holdings skyscraper in downtown Chicago, they carried themselves with the exact same suffocating, arrogant entitlement they always had. Diane had spent 2 hours in her hotel room styling her hair and applying impeccable makeup, determined to look like a high society matriarch rather than a criminal defendant. Richard wore his best tailored suit, adjusting his silk tie and puffing out his chest. He was firmly convinced he could handle this. In his deeply delusional mind, he genuinely believed his suburban country club charm could magically erase his daughter's felony. They stepped into the private executive elevator, the polished metal doors sliding shut. Stephanie was aggressively chewing her thumbnail, her eyes darting nervously around the mirrored walls. "Stop fidgeting!" Diane snapped, her voice echoing sharply in the small space. "You look guilty. We are simply going upstairs to clear up a clerical misunderstanding. Jamal's parents are reasonable people. We almost became family. We will explain that you were under immense emotional distress because of Eleanor's selfish behavior, and they will drop the charges. It is just money." The elevator chimed at the penthouse level. A silent, stern-faced security detail guided them down a long, immaculate corridor lined with modern art and frosted glass. They were led into a sweeping, cavernous boardroom that overlooked the entire Chicago skyline. Sitting at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table was Jamal. Flanking him were his parents, Marcus and Amina, the principal owners of Vanguard Holdings. They were surrounded by a phalanx of corporate litigators who sat in stone-cold silence. There were no warm greetings, no offers of coffee or sparkling water. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, clinical, and absolutely lethal. Richard, completely misreading the room and leaning entirely on his unearned privilege, marched forward with his hand outstretched and a hearty, practiced smile plastered on his face. "Marcus, Amina, thank you so much for taking the time to see us," Richard boomed, projecting his false confidence. "I know things have gotten incredibly out of hand down in Florida, but I am glad we can finally sit down and sort this out privately, family to family, so to speak." Marcus did not take Richard's hand. He let it hang in the empty air until Richard awkwardly pulled it back, a flush of red creeping up his thick neck. "Please have a seat," Marcus stated, his voice completely flat and devoid of any human warmth. They sat down in the plush leather chairs opposite the banking executives. Stephanie immediately began to cry, deploying her favorite and only weapon. She looked at Jamal, her lower lip trembling flawlessly. "Jamal, I am so sorry," she whimpered, letting her tears flow freely down her cheeks. "I was just so overwhelmed. Eleanor took everything from me. She humiliated me. I panicked. I just needed a bridge loan to get my lifestyle brand off the ground so I could prove myself to everyone. I always intended to pay it back with the profits. It was just a stupid, impulsive mistake." Diane leaned forward, placing a comforting hand on her daughter's arm before turning her most diplomatic suburban elite smile toward Amina. "Amina, surly as a mother. You understand how these things happen," Diane purred, using her most condescendingly polite tone. Stephanie was heartbroken. Her wedding was cancelled. Her sister treated her abhorrently. Young people make emotional decisions when they are grieving a relationship. We are more than willing to set up a monthly repayment plan for the funds she used. But bringing federal charges against a young woman with her whole life ahead of her over a signature, that is simply unnecessary. Richard nodded in agreement, leaning his forearms on the expensive table. "We are men of business," Marcus, Richard said, trying to force a camaraderie that did not exist. "You know how aggressive the market can be. My daughter was simply showing some entrepreneurial spirit. She took a risk. We are all people of a certain status here. We can handle things quietly. We do not destroy each other over a simple financial misunderstanding." Jamal slowly closed the file folder resting in front of him. He looked at Richard, then at Diane, and finally at the weeping Stephanie. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 50 stories below. "I am not the one you need to apologize to, Stephanie," Jamal said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. He slid the thick manila folder down the polished length of the table. "You did not just forge my name. You attempted to defraud my family's institution." Dr. Marcus Winston placed his large, steady hands over the file. He was a man who had built a global financial empire from the absolute ground up. He possessed a terrifying absolute stillness that commanded the sprawling boardroom without him having to raise his voice by a single decibel. He looked at Richard with a gaze so piercing and analytical, it stripped away every layer of Richard's suburban country club facade. "Men of business," Richard Marcus began, his deep baritone resonating against the glass walls of the penthouse. You walk into my boardroom, a sanctuary built on decades of relentless, grueling work, and you attempt to invoke the language of peers. You actually expect to charm your way out of a federal felony with a handshake, a forced smile, and a vague promise of a monthly repayment plan. Marcus leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. I have watched your family closely for the past 2 years. I watched how you operated when Jamal and your daughter were engaged. I heard the thinly veiled comments. I noticed the subtle, implicit surprise that a black family could own the very institution that holds the mortgage on your precious, exclusive golf club. You tolerated my son because of our net worth. You smiled at my wife and me because of our capital. But in your minds, beneath your polite suburban manners, you always believed you were inherently superior. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a performance of extreme offense. Marcus, that is entirely untrue and completely unfair. We have always respected your family. We are good people. Do not speak, Marcus commanded, the sheer authority in his voice snapping Diane's mouth shut instantly. You are not here to debate your morality. You are here to face the absolute reality of your arrogance. You thought you could walk in here with your white upper-class entitlement and bulldoze over us. You thought we would quietly sweep a massive financial crime under the rug to save you from social embarrassment. You assumed we would bend to your will because you believe the rules do not apply to people who look like you. Marcus turned his dark, unyielding gaze toward Stephanie. She shrank back into her leather chair, shaking uncontrollably. A simple financial misunderstanding, your mother calls it, Marcus said, opening the folder and extracting a stack of bank records. You bypassed our highest security protocols. You utilized Jamal's private access codes, which you stole from his personal safe. You forged his signature on a $4 million commercial loan application. You deliberately bypassed the holding period and immediately drew down $1 million in cash. Stephanie squeezed her eyes shut, crying harder. I just wanted to start my business. I wanted to be successful like Eleanor. You wanted the illusion of success without doing a single day of actual work. Marcus corrected her flawlessly. We tracked the funds. You funneled that stolen million into offshore shell accounts. And what did you purchase? Build this great business. A luxury public relations retainer to artificially inflate your social media presence. A leased Italian sports car. $50,000 in designer wardrobes. You stole $1 million from a federal bank to buy clothes and fake internet followers. That is not a mistake made out of grief. Marcus continued, his voice dropping like an anvil. That is calculated, systematic, and intentional fraud. The Department of Justice does not care about your canceled wedding. They care about wire fraud and identity theft. My legal team forwarded the complete, unredacted audit trail to the federal prosecutor's office 2 hours ago. You will be formally indicted by Friday. You are going to a federal penitentiary, Stephanie. There is no settlement. There is no quiet arrangement. Stephanie let out a choked, guttural wail, burying her face in her hands. She looked wildly at Jamal, begging silently with her eyes, but he simply stared back like he was looking at a complete stranger. Now as for you, Richard, Marcus said, tapping his gold pen against the table. Your daughter needed substantial collateral to secure the initial tranche of that massive loan before our fraud department flagged the forgery. She leveraged the only assets she had access to. Your suburban estate, your remaining real estate portfolio. She cross-collateralized absolutely everything you own. Richard's jaw dropped. The remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. No. No, she could not do that. She does not have the authorization. The deeds are in my name. The accounts require my direct approval. She used your corporate seals, Richard, Marcus explained with clinical precision. She committed fraud against you just as she committed fraud against my bank. But unlike Vanguard Holdings, you are heavily underwater. Our analysts reviewed your portfolio. You are currently defaulting on your primary mortgages. Your credit is completely leveraged. Because Vanguard Holdings is the primary lien holder on your estate, and because the loan is now in hard default due to fraudulent criminal activity, we are executing our right of immediate acceleration. Marcus stood up, towering over the long table, casting a long shadow over my terrified family. We are calling in the full debt. Effective today at noon, Vanguard Holdings initiated aggressive foreclosure proceedings on your primary residence and ordered the immediate liquidation of your remaining commercial properties. The sheriffs will be at your home tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp to serve the formal eviction notices. You will be locked out of your own house. You have lost everything. Diane let out a sharp, hysterical cry, digging her perfectly manicured nails into Richard's arm. Richard, do something. Tell them they cannot do this. We will be on the street. We will lose everything we have built. Our friends, our reputation, our entire lives. Your reputation is already dead, Diane Marcus stated, his voice devoid of any pity. You brought this entirely upon yourselves. You chose to value your hollow social status over basic human decency. You attempted to destroy your other daughter to maintain an illusion of wealth. You raised a thief and a fraud, and you enabled her every single step of the way because you thought your privilege made you completely untouchable. Marcus buttoned his tailored suit jacket, signaling the absolute end of the meeting. You walked into this building thinking your entitlement would shield you, Marcus concluded. You thought you could smile and smooth over a felony because you view yourselves as the rightful elite. You are nothing but parasites, and Vanguard Holdings does not negotiate with parasites. Jamal stood up next to his father, looking down at the weeping, broken family that had tried to exploit his wealth and ruin my life. My security team will escort you out of the building through the service elevator, Jamal told them. My lawyers will communicate exclusively with your public defenders. I highly suggest you spend whatever remaining cash you have hidden in your pockets to hire criminal representation. You are going to need it. Goodbye, Stephanie. Enjoy the reality of your lifestyle brand. The restaurant fell silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the shifting of the remaining federal agents securing the evidence. I stood alone near the head of the table, breathing in the quiet, peaceful air. I looked down at the forged documents and the itemized invoice scattered on the floor. A lifetime of manipulation, theft, and emotional abuse had finally been settled. The ledger was clear. I walked toward the exit, ready to go home to my son, leaving the ruins of my former family behind me forever. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained open, framing the two towering security guards who stepped forward at Jamal's command. The absolute silence in the penthouse was suffocating. The reality of their total annihilation hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. There was no negotiation left, no hands to shake, no polite suburban smiles to hide behind. Richard stared at the closed manila folder on the table as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. The pristine image of the wealthy patriarch shattered in an instant. He slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto his wife. The sheer venom in his gaze made Diane physically recoil. "This is your fault," Richard hissed, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it bordered on madness. Diane blinked, her hands flying to her throat. "Richard, what are you saying?" "I am saying you destroyed us," he roared, the sudden volume echoing violently off the glass walls. "You coddled her. You indulged every single ridiculous fantasy she ever had. You taught her that consequences were for other people. You raised a thief, Diane. You raised a fraudulent, entitled parasite who just signed away everything I spent my entire life building. My house, my properties, my legacy. Gone. All of it gone because you refused to tell your precious daughter the word no." Diane's shock melted instantly into vicious, defensive fury. Her carefully constructed country club demeanor evaporated, revealing the ugly, selfish core beneath. "How dare you blame me?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger an inch from Richard's face. "You were the one who bought her the cars. You were the one who paid off her credit cards every time she maxed them out. You turned a blind eye because you loved playing the big rich provider. You knew we were drowning in debt, Richard. You knew Vanguard Holdings held our mortgages, but you kept spending just to keep up appearances at the golf club. You are a coward. You are weak, and you are trying to make me the scapegoat for your financial incompetence." They circled each other like rabid animals. The loyalty, the decades of marriage, the united front they had always presented to the world vanished entirely. Stripped of their wealth, they had absolutely nothing left holding them together except mutual hatred. "Shut up!" Stephanie screamed, pushing herself up from the leather chair. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect blowout ruined. She looked wildly between her mother and father, her face contorted with panic and disgust. "Just shut up, both of you. You are completely useless." Richard whipped around to face his daughter, his hands balled into tight fists. "Useless. You forged a federal bank document. You stole $1 million. You put my name on the line for your criminal vanity project. Because you told me we were elite," Stephanie yelled back, her voice cracking hysterically. "You told me the rules did not apply to us. You told me I was better than Eleanor, better than Jamal, better than everyone else. And now what? You have zero money. You have zero power. You cannot even hire a decent lawyer to keep me out of a federal penitentiary. You are broke. You are pathetic. What kind of parents let their daughter go to prison? We are going to be living on the street because of you," Diane sobbed, grabbing Stephanie's arm. You cross-collateralized our home. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? What are we supposed to tell our friends? I do not care about your stupid friends." Stephanie shoved her mother backward with brutal force. Diane stumbled her heel, catching on the carpet, sending her crashing hard into the edge of the conference table. Stephanie did not even flinch. "I care about the Department of Justice coming after me. You were supposed to fix this. You were supposed to use your connections and make this go away. But you are nothing. You are fake rich. You have always been fake rich. I hate you. I hate both of you." The moral rot of the family was fully exposed under the bright penthouse lights. There was no love. There was no sacrifice. When faced with the absolute destruction of their unearned privilege, they devoured each other instantly. They were willing to throw their own flesh and blood to the wolves if it meant saving their own skin. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, deep, and completely devoid of emotion. The head of Vanguard Holdings Security stepped into the room. He was a massive man in a dark suit, his posture radiating professional authority. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer command in his tone instantly silenced the screaming match. "This meeting is concluded," the security chief stated. "You are trespassing on Vanguard Holdings property. You will surrender your visitor badges immediately, and you will follow us to the service elevators." Richard tried to straighten his suit jacket, desperately attempting to claw back a fraction of his lost dignity. "I demand to use the main elevator," he choked out, his voice shaking. "We are not criminals yet. You are defaulting debtors under active federal investigation." The security chief corrected smoothly, stepping directly into Richard's personal space. "The main lobby is reserved for respected clients and employees. You fall into neither category. Hand over the badges, now." Defeated, Richard unclipped the plastic badge from his lapel and dropped it onto the table. Diane followed suit, her hands trembling so violently she could barely operate the clasp. Stephanie simply stared at the floor, tears streaming down her ruined makeup, her chest heaving as she tossed her badge onto the pile. "Right this way," the second security guard said, gesturing toward a heavy unmarked door at the far end of the hallway. The walk of shame began. They were not marched through the gleaming glass atrium with its panoramic views of the city. They were directed into the stark concrete service corridors. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the cold industrial reality of their descent. There were no plush carpets here, no polite receptionists offering sparkling water, just the echoing thud of their footsteps against the concrete floor. Stephanie dragged her feet, sobbing audibly with every step. Diane leaned against the cinder-block wall as they waited for the freight elevator, looking as though she might collapse entirely. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, refusing to look at his wife or his daughter. The heavy metal doors of the service elevator groaned open. The guards ushered them inside. The ride down was painfully slow, 50 stories of silence surrounded by cleaning supplies and stacked cardboard boxes. They were being treated exactly like the trash they were swept out the back door, so they would not contaminate the pristine environment of the people they had tried to extort. When the doors finally parted at ground level, they were led through a loading dock. The heavy steel roll-up door was open, revealing the bustling, noisy city street. The security chief stopped at the threshold. "Do not attempt to re-enter this building. Do not attempt to contact Dr. Jamal Winston, or anyone affiliated with Vanguard Holdings. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. Have a good evening." The guards stepped back, the heavy steel door rumbling as it began to close. Richard, Diane, and Stephanie stumbled out onto the concrete pavement. The humid city air hit them instantly. There was no luxury town car waiting for them at the curb. There was no valet to open their doors. They stood on a dirty sidewalk next to a row of dumpsters, the roar of rush hour traffic deafening in their ears. Diane clutched her expensive purse against her chest, looking wildly up and down the street. Richard, she panicked. How are we getting home? My credit cards were declined this morning. Richard stared blankly at the passing cars. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding train. They had no home to go to. The sheriff was arriving at 8 o'clock the next morning to lock the doors of their estate. They had no cash. They had no credit. They had no future. Stephanie sank onto the dirty curb, burying her face in her hands, her wails completely drowned out by the unforgiving noise of the city. They had walked into the Vanguard building believing they were untouchable royalty. They were dumped onto the street as penniless criminals entirely alone and entirely destroyed. 6 months passed. The swift, brutal gears of federal justice and corporate foreclosure crushed the very last remnants of Richard's fake suburban empire. The fallout was absolute and merciless. Stripped of their assets, their credit, and their hollow social standing, my parents were violently expelled from the wealthy bubble they had worshipped for decades. Richard and Diane now reside in a cramped, decaying two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The building smells perpetually of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke. The peeling linoleum floors and the flickering, buzzing fluorescent lights in their hallway are a stark daily reminder of their spectacular downfall. I hear through the corporate grapevine that Richard spends his days sitting in a sagging armchair, staring blankly out of a grease-stained window at a brick wall. His country club memberships were revoked the morning after his arrest. His vintage car collection was liquidated at a police auction for pennies on the dollar. Diane, who once scoffed at anyone wearing off-the-rack clothing and judged people by the logos on their handbags, now waits in line at the local municipal office. She stands under the harsh glare of government lighting, clutching a worn folder of paperwork to renew their monthly food stamps. They are entirely isolated. They are financially toxic. Their high society friends, the people they had sacrificed my well-being to impress, deleted their numbers the very second the federal extortion indictments became public record. They are ghosts living in a world that no longer cares they exist. Stephanie managed to avoid hard prison time by taking a desperate 11th-hour plea deal. She turned state's evidence testifying against Connor, his father, and the hired thugs she brought across state lines. But a felony conviction on a federal wire fraud charge permanently destroyed any chance she had at a glamorous life. Her fake lifestyle brand collapsed overnight. The thousands of internet followers vanished. The luxury PR retainers dissolved into thin air. She is currently working the afternoon shift as a cashier at a massive, unforgiving discount supermarket. The ultimate irony of her situation is inescapable. The automated point-of-sale system she uses to scan discounted canned goods, weigh cheap produce, and print receipts is powered by a high-level inventory management AI developed explicitly by Novatech. Every single time she logs into her register to begin her grueling minimum wage shift, she is forced to stare at my company's logo glowing brightly on the digital display. She spends 8 hours a day on her aching feet ringing up groceries under the inescapable digitized shadow of the sister she tried to destroy. I drove past that supermarket once. I did not stop. I did not go inside to gloat. I did not need to. The simple knowledge of her crushing daily reality was deeply satisfying all on its own. My reality, however, is entirely different. A cool, crisp evening breeze sweeps across the sprawling, immaculate rooftop terrace of my Chicago penthouse. I am hosting a small, intimate celebration. There are no hired thugs lurking in the shadows, no forced fake suburban smiles, and absolutely no arrogant posturing. The air is filled with the easy, genuine laughter of trusted colleagues, close friends, and the people who actually matter in my life. A soft, elegant jazz melody drifts from the hidden outdoor speakers, blending seamlessly with the ambient rhythmic hum of the city traffic far below. Near the edge of the terrace, bathed in the warm golden glow of the outdoor heating lamps, my son Leo sits at a polished marble table. He is entirely unbothered by the past, looking healthy, sharp, and intensely focused on a hand-carved wooden chessboard. Sitting opposite him is Dr. Marcus Winston, the fearsome global financial titan. The man who had verbally shattered my father with a single calculating look is currently smiling warmly. He leans forward patiently, offering Leo gentle advice on how to execute a flawless Sicilian defense strategy. Seeing my son safe, thriving, and being mentored by a man of actual substance and integrity fills my chest with an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. I step toward the heavy glass railing holding a crystal flute of deep red vintage wine. Jamal walks up beside me, leaning casually against the railing. He looks incredibly relaxed, the heavy burden of the extortion plot and his family's entanglement completely lifted from his shoulders. We clink our glasses together, the delicate crystal chiming clearly in the cool night air. We are no longer just survivors of a mutual nightmare brought on by my toxic family. We are equal, formidable business partners. Novatech and Vanguard Holdings recently closed a massive multi-billion-dollar joint venture, seamlessly merging my artificial intelligence frameworks with his family's global banking infrastructure. The deal made front-page financial headlines for a solid week, cementing both our legacies in the corporate world. Jamal takes a slow sip of his drink, looking out at the sprawling, glittering skyline. "We built something incredible, Eleanor," he says quietly, his voice carrying deep respect. "We cut out the rot, and we built something that is actually going to last." I look out over the brilliant, endless lights of Chicago stretching out into the dark horizon. The air is remarkably clear. My mind is sharper than it has ever been. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, letting the rich, complex taste settle on my tongue. I smile, feeling the absolute, untouchable power of my own independence radiating through my veins. The people who tried to break me are sweeping floors and begging for government assistance, while I stand at the very top of the city they once tried to rule. "When they call you worthless, do not cry." I say softly, the words carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute truth. Buy their entire world and erase their names from it.